In this unit, we are going to spend the entire unit or the entire chapter working with integers. So if we're going to do an entire unit based off of integers, it would make a lot of sense that we spend our first lesson talking about what an integer is and thinking about some basic things that we should know about working with integers. And then as we move through the unit, we're going to talk about the rules for working with integers, different calculations that we can do with integers, and learn why those rules work. So that's kind of the theme of this entire chapter. So an integer, this thing that we're working with for the entire unit. An integer is the math word for any positive or negative whole number. And when we say whole number, we're actually using that word informally in this definition. But what we mean by that is that we're not including any fractions or any decimals. So integers do not include fractions or decimals, but they can be positive or negative. So what's right below this definition is a number line for us to think about integers, positives and negatives, and how they work. So one question that a lot of people have, which we're going to answer, has to do with 0 and what happens with 0. So 0 is kind of the middle of a number line. It divides the negatives from the positives. So everything on this side of the number line is positive numbers. So positive numbers are anything that is bigger than 0. So when we talk about bigger and smaller, we're really talking about right and left. So things to the right on the number line are larger numbers. Everything on the other side of 0, so everything down here, the red end, those are negative numbers. When we're going down the number line, then we get smaller. So negative numbers are always smaller than positive numbers. Now notice I did not actually highlight the 0 because 0 does something different. 0 is the boundary line between a negative number and a positive number. So you can think of it kind of like the fence between two pieces of property. It's right on the line. It doesn't belong to either person. So 0 is neither. It is not negative. It is not positive. It's just neither of them. It's the neutral territory or the neutral ground between the two. So that's important to realize, and that's a question that I get asked sometimes when people are working with integers, and they ask me, well, is 0 positive or negative? It is neither. When we are graphing, so if we have a number line, we can graph integers on a number line. So if we're graphing an integer on a number line, I'm going to make a different number line just to show you, because that one has been all marked up. One other thing about making a number line too, positive numbers, we don't always put the plus sign in front of it. So if a number is just missing the sign in front of it, then we assume it's positive. But if you're working with a negative number, you have to have the negative sign in front of it. So another way of drawing the number line that we had up there would be to do something like I just did. So if you notice these plus signs that were in front of the numbers, I'm not writing down on the second number line because we don't always have to. I just put them on the first one to help you see where the positives and where the negatives were. So if we wanted to, we could mark a point on a number line. So the points that we mark on the number line are called coordinates. So we can graph coordinates or a point on a number line. That was very sloppy, I'm sorry. Point on a number line. So if I wanted to mark the point 2, the way I would do that is just by putting a dot. So we use dots for coordinates, just putting a dot over the 2. And it's a good idea to make your dot big enough that it's easy to see. If you make it really tiny, so I put a dot at 3, but I made it really tiny, people might miss it. So make it big enough that people aren't going to miss it when you mark it on there. But that's how you can mark or how you can graph points or coordinates on a number line. Now, there is one other thing, and I'm actually going to reuse the same number line to talk about that with you guys. There's one other thing that we need to talk about if we are going to work with negative numbers. Sometimes we want to measure the distance that a number is away from 0, but we can go two directions with that, because if we go on one side of 0, we have positive numbers, and if we go on the other side of 0, we have negative numbers. So for instance, if I wanted to know where 3 is, that's 3 away from 0. But I could also measure 3 away from 0 the other direction. That would put me at negative 3. So 3 and negative 3 are both 3 away from 0. There are cases in real life where we care about how far we're going. So we care about the 3, but we don't care about which direction. So we don't care if we're going left or right. So an example from real life might be if you're walking to the store. So you might tell your friend, I'm walking 2 blocks to the store. When you turn around to come home, you're not going to say, I'm walking negative 2 blocks back home. You're just going to say, I'm walking 2 blocks home. So in that case, it doesn't really matter whether you're going to the store or from the store. The only thing that matters is how far you're walking, that 2 blocks. So that's an example of real life of where we don't care about which direction we're going. We just care about how far. So when we only care about how far and we don't care about which direction we're going, then we're working with something called absolute value. So absolute value is something you need to know about if you're going to work with integers. So absolute value measures how far a number is from 0 on a number line. And it has its own symbol. So when we're working with absolute value, they look a little bit like parentheses, but they're not parentheses. They're just vertical bars. So if I wanted the absolute value of 3, I would put a 3 inside vertical bars. So these vertical bars are an absolute value symbol. And then if we wanted to find the absolute value, once you evaluate or you find the absolute value, then you don't need the bars anymore. Kind of like when you're doing order of operations. Once you figure out what's inside the parentheses, you don't need the parentheses anymore. It's the same sort of idea. So in this case, this is asking the absolute value of 3. So it's asking how far from 0 is 3. Well, we marked that up here on our number line. So 3 is 3 away from 0. So the absolute value of 3 is 3. I could also come along and I could do that with a negative number. So if I asked, what is the absolute value of negative 3? Well, if you look over here, negative 3 is also 3 away from 0. So it would have the same answer. So the absolute value of negative 3 is also 3. So basically, because we don't care which way we're going, absolute value will always be a positive number, will always be a positive measurement. So that's a good, when you're actually working with it, trick to remember is that absolute value will always give you a positive answer. When you're working with absolute value in a problem, absolute value works on the same level as parentheses. So if you have an absolute value symbol, you need to do the absolute value before you do any other calculations. So once you figure out what the absolute value is, then you can move on and do any other calculations that you're being asked to do with the number.